Hi, everybody. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the second topic related to efficiency. And for each of these, we're going to look at like different things that affect efficiency. So taxes and price ceilings and price floors and all that. Let's get started. So taxes is what this whole lecture is all about. And there are a few things that I'm going to highlight down below in the slideshow. And I'm going to remind you that you have access to all of my slideshows because some of the graphs in this lecture in particular and the following ones can be a little bit tough to see. So it's good if you pull those up as well. Now, taxes, what are they? Well, they're just compulsory contributions to tax revenue. They just mean that you have to pay the state. That's all it is. And there are two purposes. One is to raise tax revenue to pay for government stuff, right? They need money to pay for their government stuff. And second, sometimes taxes are just used to reduce the quantity of transactions. And we'll see why that happens actually shortly. So either one of those, or maybe even both. Now, there are three types of tax systems, and then you have to know these for this class. There are progressive taxes, proportional, and regressive. A progressive tax is generally one in which as your income rises, the proportion that you pay of your income in taxes rises faster. So like if your income rises, right, we'd say that much, then your tax rises even more, right? So like as your income rises, your tax bill rises faster. Proportional means that as your income rises, the proportion of your income that you pay in taxes stays the same. So it's sometimes called a flat tax for that reason, because no matter how much money you earn, you pay exactly the same percentage or proportion of your income. Regressive taxes are ones where as your income, right, as your income, we would say rises, you pay less of it in taxes. So the ratio means they work in reverse. So like as your income rises, you pay more in taxes typically, but not enough to keep up with the increase in your income. Now, the United States' federal income tax structure is progressive. It means that as your income rises, the portion of your income that you pay in taxes rises faster, actually. Now, it's not a flat tax, but there are some states that use flat taxes, and that's relatively common. Social Security taxes are basically flat taxes up to a certain point where actually they're exempt. So anything you earn over a certain point are totally exempt, which actually means that Social Security taxes are a little bit closer to being regressive than anything else. Sales taxes are another example of ones that are often classified as regressive because typically, although your income rises, you're going to buy more things and therefore you're going to pay more sales tax. It doesn't rise quite as much, right? There's only so many things people purchase, and as people's income rise, their consumption actually falls. So that's a complicated way of saying that sales taxes are often considered regressive. Now, different way that we think about taxes is also how they're levied, which means how people pay them. And there are two types that you have to know for this class, and there's two additional types that is good to know for like life. So the two you have to know for the class are called per unit and lump sum. Now, tragically, these two are not the most common types. In fact, the most common types of taxes are ad valorem and income. So I'll tell you what those are first, and then I'll talk about the ones that are for this class. Ad valorem simply means to the value. That's a Latin phrase. It means to the value. So it's a tax that's based on the value of the unit sold. So a sales tax is basically an ad valorem tax. Most of the time, if they say it's 7% sales tax, it's based on a percentage of the value of the unit being sold. These are really hard to model in a basic kind of introductory framework, and so we don't model ad valorem taxes in an intro economics class at the college level. Income taxes, likewise, are also kind of tricky. Because they typically are progressive and they affect a bunch of other things, we don't usually model them in this class, but they're basically deductions from your personal income or from a business income, like profit. The two that we will model in this class do happen. They're real taxes. One's called a per unit, and that basically means every time a unit gets sold, it's a fixed amount that you have to pay. So like every time you buy Diet Coke, you pay $1. That's a fixed cost. It doesn't matter like if the Diet Coke was $3 or $4 or $10, you paid $1 every single time. So they're actually relatively easy to model. The lump sum tax is you add a certain cost just because you transact. It doesn't matter how many transactions you do, you just have to pay it. And so we'll look at what those look like as well in this class. There are two types of special taxes that you'll see the names of them come up. They're both per unit taxes. So really, they're just fancy ways of trying to throw you off. An excise tax is a per unit tax on sales of goods. And so gasoline has an excise tax. Every time you buy a gallon of gasoline, you actually pay a per unit tax to the federal government in the amount of like 25 cents a gallon. Don't quote me on that, but it's a fixed amount. Alcohol also, cigarettes also. Sometimes they're called sin taxes because they're usually on sinful products. Tariffs are per unit taxes on the value of imported goods. And so they would only apply to things that you're buying from other countries. We're going to look at those in this class as well. Tax incidence. And so this is another concept here that sometimes students get a little hung up on, and I'll show you some tricks for it. Basically, it's the question of, does the consumer or the producer pay the burden of the tax? It's not who has the receipt, right? You know, it's not what it says on the receipt. It's not who writes the check. Those are totally irrelevant to us. It's actually who bears the burden of it. The other way to think about it is who loses more surplus as a result of the tax, okay? So the idea behind this is just it depends on the relative elasticities of supply and demand. Whichever one is more elastic has less of the tax burden. Whichever one is more inelastic has more of the tax burden. The simple way to remember this is the more elastic escapes the tax. I'll say that again, the more elastic escapes the tax. More elastic escapes, right? So all you have to do is look at it and go, okay, is the supply elastic compared to the demand curve? Whichever one's more elastic escapes having to pay it. Now they might have to pay some of it, but the more elastic you are, the less of the tax you pay. So for example, excise taxes on cigarettes are almost entirely paid by buyers because they have very inelastic demand, but the supply for cigarettes is pretty elastic. So if the government slaps $1 tax on a pack of cigarettes, who's paying it? The people who are buying the cigarettes, actually. Even though the receipt, might say blah, 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 the cigarette companies don't even really care about taxes on their products because they only care if you're going to take that tax revenue and turn it into anti-smoking ads, right? But otherwise, they're whatever, tax it. People are going to have to pay it. It's their problem. The second example is sales taxes on yachts. And this was a really common thing because yachts are usually bought by rich people, right? Let's be honest here. New Jersey actually right now is talking about repealing a sales tax exemption on boats. And I just pulled that out because I was like, oh, that's funny. The thing about this is yachts have really elastic demand, right? They're a luxury product. They're a large portion of your income. Rich people are going to be like, if the yacht's more expensive, no thank you. I'll just pass. I'll take a foreign trip or something. However, the suppliers of yachts, the people who build them, have pretty inelastic supply because it's a small business and it's tough to ramp up production. So if you slap a tax on yachts, the more elastic one escapes paying the tax. So who ends up paying? Well, the small business that builds the yachts. And so it doesn't even, the millionaires are whatever. The yacht builders, those small businesses, those are the ones who have to pay. So let's take a look at graphing per unit taxes. Now, I don't want you to graph this, but this picture down below hopefully will illustrate what's going on in this. So I'm going to draw the picture, but you'll kind of see as well with these slides. So the first thing we're going to do is have a demand curve and a supply curve. And it's useful to have the little dots to say this is where the price and the quantity used to be, and we'll just say it's 12 and 5. Now, what a per unit tax will do is it's going to add to the cost of producing. And a supply curve is really just the cost of producing. So at every single quantity, it's going to shift that supply curve up or to the left. Now, it doesn't mean that supply is increasing if it shifts to the left, right? It's a decrease, but vertically, it's going to move up. So we're going to do S tax. And so think of it like we're adding every time, we're just adding costs every single time. So we move up every single quantity. And so it shifts it up by the amount of the tax, right? So the distance between the two, that distance there is the per unit tax. That's the per unit amount of the tax. Now, what's the new price though that people pay? Well, they pay up here where supply and demand intersect. So the new price that the buyers pay, buyers pay, in this example will be 6. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit, but I'm using the same numbers that are down below as well. But how much of the $6 do the sellers get to keep? Well, they don't get to keep all 6. They only get to keep 4 because remember the tax is actually the distance between them. Now, if we just go down, we draw a dotted line. The nice thing is the distance will be the same between them, right? The per unit amount it's shifted up by the same amount every single time. So this has to be 4 if we know that the distance between them, the $2, is the tax, right? Now, a couple additional concepts, right? We can see in the picture below and the picture here what happens to consumer surplus. Well, it gets smaller. It used to include this rectangle and this tiny little triangle here, and producer surplus also got smaller, right? They gave up they gave up this rectangle below and that little triangle right there. So the producers and the consumers bore the burden of this tax. Now, the green box that's displayed down below, that's the amount of tax revenue that this generates. Now, that shouldn't be that surprising, right? Because if now we're selling 10 units and the tax is $2 a piece, so the tax revenue is the $2 tax, the amount per unit, right, times the 10 that we sell for $20, and that's the area of that green box. Now, what does that leave this little box here? Well, these are transactions that don't happen anymore. We used to have 12, and now we have 10. Those transactions are gone, and we got nothing. It didn't get turned into tax revenue. It didn't become consumer or producer surplus. It just went gone, and that is deadweight loss. DWL. We can quantify that if you want, right? You could sit down and be like, all right, well then, the base of the triangle is 2, and the height of the triangle is 1, so 2 divided by 1. So that like the total value of the deadweight loss in this picture and the one we drew is $2. So we could say that that's the cost of all of this to society is $2. Okay, now we're gonna do producer and consumer tax incidents. Now, in these two pictures, they're a little bit wonky, but I'm going to walk you through them, and then we're going to draw the picture over here, okay? So the first thing is to observe on the left, I have a demand curve that's really inelastic and a supply curve that's pretty elastic. And over on the right, I have a demand curve that's elastic and a supply curve that's inelastic. And I've gone ahead and I've color-coded the producer and consumer surpluses for you. So our question is, who's paying more of the tax? So the tax, right, shifts that supply curve kind of up by the amount of the tax. That's the vertical distance. And you can see that the new amount of producer surplus and consumer surplus is different, right? Now we've lost something here in the middle. Some of this is going to be tax revenue and some of it's going to be deadweight loss. And so who lost more surplus? Let's go back for a second, right? In this left picture, who lost more, the blue or the orange? Well, pretty clearly the blue did, right? The blue gave up this huge box in that triangle, and the orange gave up just a little bit. Over here on the right, who gave up more surplus? We have orange and then blue. Well, clearly the orange did. And so we can think about this and say, who paid more of the tax? Well, the demand on the left is really inelastic, so the buyers paid more of it. They gave up more surplus. And in fact, if you look at the size of that box, the green box, and you compare it to like where they used to be, you can see that the buyers pay almost entirely that tax on the left. And on the right, the sellers paid most of it because they're paying a huge chunk of the green rectangle. Now, what do we want to graph? Now, pretty simply, if you can just sketch a picture that even looks like that, you'll be just fine. Don't stress too much. You're probably not going to be asked to draw something like this on a test, but you might be asked to interpret it. So we're going to do this, P and Q. We're going to do a really steep demand curve and a pretty flatly sloped supply curve. And we'd see here, dot, 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 over. And then let's put a tax in, S tax. So the new price that's paid is up here. Buyer paid, right? And the seller got to keep down here at the bottom. Seller, and it's actually even a little bit hard to see because of how sloped these are. But you can see here the seller. And so which one of these paid more of that box? Well, all of this part of the box was paid by the buyer, and this part of the box was paid by the seller. So clearly the buyer gave up a lot, right? The buyer's burden is here, and the seller's burden is there. And so obviously the buyer has a pretty big tax burden. On the right-hand side, let's do one where the demand curve is really flat. That might be even a little bit too flat for me to show. And the supply curve is really vertical, okay? And so the original is here, like that, okay? And then let's do, and so it's a pretty big tax, right? Like if we were to continue it, it'd go like way up here. So the new S tax is here. So the new price the buyers paid was there, okay? But the original sellers, boy, they're really they're losing quite a bit here, aren't they? And so this almost is comical because it's so bad for the sellers in this case. So the seller burden is like humongous. It goes even beyond the graph. And the buyer burden is like right here. But the amount of the tax is so large because of how I shifted it there that it's like that. So you can see that these are a little bit hard to sketch, right? So the sellers pay a huge burden here, and the buyers pay very little of the tax here. Back in the beginning of this, the true-false list, I said if they put a tax, if the Cardinals have a tax on their tickets at the stadium, then they share the tax equally. This is why they aren't, because the Cardinals have a very inelastic supply curve. And so if you put a tax in on something with the really inelastic supply curve, the ones who are inelastic actually pay the burden of the tax. So taxes on stadium tickets are almost entirely borne by the people who own the stadium, not the people who are buying the tickets to go see the things. Even though they're going to be like, oh, you have to pay so much more in taxes, they're going to convince you to not support it because they, the Cardinals and the, the stadium owners and people like that, they are the ones who actually bear the incidence of it. All right, so hopefully this helps you. See you next time.